My name is Dorothy. I'm 64 years old, and I spent 31 years teaching elementary school in Savannah, Georgia. I thought I understood pain. I thought I understood suffering. You spend 3 decades watching children come to school with hollow eyes and flinching when adults raise their voices, and you think you know what abuse looks like from the outside. But I never imagined I'd spend the last 8 years of my marriage living it from the inside. I never imagined I'd be the woman lying on a hospital gurney while my husband stood over me, squeezing my hand just a little too hard, whispering a story about a slippery driveway that had absolutely nothing to do with how I ended up there. What the emergency room doctor discovered that night didn't just expose my husband's lie, it saved what was left of my life. And I'm still shaking as I tell you this, even now, 2 years later, because the woman I was when I walked into that marriage would not recognize the woman who walked out of it. But I need you to hear this story. I need you to hear it because I was 62 years old, and I still didn't leave. I was educated, I was independent, I had a career and a pension and a grown daughter who loved me, and I still stayed. If I stayed, anyone can stay, and if I finally got out, anyone can get out. Before I take you back to the beginning, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything to me. It tells me I'm not alone in this, that someone out there is listening, that maybe this story reaches the right person at the right time. Thank you. Now let me tell you how I got here. I met my husband when I was 53 years old. I'd been divorced once before. A gentle ending to a quiet marriage that simply ran out of love. My first husband and I parted as friends. We raised our daughter together, and to this day I consider him a decent man. So when I met my husband at a church fundraiser in the spring, I thought I knew what a good man looked like. I thought I had enough life experience to recognize the warning signs. I thought I was too old and too wise to be fooled. I was wrong about all of it. He was charming in that particular way that older men can be charming, attentive without being suffocating. He remembered things I mentioned in passing. He called when he said he would call. He held doors open and asked thoughtful questions and looked at me like I was still worth looking at, which meant more to me at 53 than I would ever want to admit. My daughter liked him. My sister liked him. My friends from church liked him. Everyone agreed I had found something rare, a good man who treated a woman with genuine respect. We dated for 2 years. He proposed on my front porch on a Tuesday evening with a modest ring and a speech that made me cry. We got married in a small ceremony with family and close friends. I wore a cream-colored dress. He wore a navy suit. I remember thinking that this was the best decision of my life, this quiet, steady happiness I have found in my 50s, when I had mostly stopped expecting to find anything at all. We had been married for 14 months when it started. It didn't start with hitting. I want to be very clear about that because I think a lot of people imagine abuse begins with a slap, with something obvious and physical that you can point to and name. It didn't start that way. It started with a look, a particular silence that filled a room. A way of setting his fork down on his plate that made my stomach tighten before I understood why. The first time he raised his voice at me, we had been married for about a year. I had made plans to have dinner with my daughter without mentioning it to him first. She lived 40 minutes away, and we had a standing habit of getting together every few weeks, something we had done for years. He came home from work to an empty house and a note on the refrigerator. By the time I got home, he was sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, and the look on his face stopped me in the doorway. "You didn't think to tell me," he said. His voice was quiet. That was somehow worse than shouting. I told him I was sorry, that I hadn't thought about it, that it was just dinner with my daughter. He stared at me for a long moment, and then he said something that I have never forgotten. He said, "I thought you were different. I thought you actually respected me." I spent the next 3 days apologizing. I brought it up over breakfast, and he would look through me like I wasn't there. I reached for his hand in the evening, and he pulled it away. I lay awake next to him in our bed, feeling like I had committed some crime I couldn't fully name. And when he finally forgave me, when he finally touched my face gently and said he knew I hadn't meant anything by it, I felt such enormous relief that I promised myself I would never cause that feeling again. I would be more considerate, more communicative. I would check in before making plans. That was how it began, not with violence, with silence and withdrawal, and the particular kind of emotional punishment that leaves no marks. Over the following months, he built a set of rules that I followed without ever realizing they were rules. I checked in before making plans. I didn't discuss our relationship with my daughter or my sister because he said private things should stay private. I stopped having my friends over to the house because he found it stressful after long work days. Slowly, carefully, the circle of my life got smaller. And then, about 2 years into the marriage, it became physical. We were arguing about money. He had moved his savings into a joint account when we married, and I had done the same, which at the time felt like a gesture of commitment and trust. I wanted to write a check to my daughter who was going through a difficult stretch financially. He said no. I said it was my money too. He looked at me across the kitchen counter, and for one strange second, I saw something in his face I had never seen before. Then his hand came across and hit me on the side of my head. Open palm, not a fist. Hard enough to make my ear ring and my vision blur for a moment. I stood there gripping the counter, and neither of us said anything for a very long time. Then he walked out of the kitchen. He came back an hour later and said he'd had a long week and he wasn't himself and it would never happen again. He said it with such calm certainty that I almost believed him. I told myself it was the stress. I told myself that I had pushed him. I told myself that I was 60 years old and starting over was not a real option, that I had made a commitment in a church in front of God and people I loved, and that one incident in 2 years did not make someone a bad person. I covered the bruise near my ear with my hair, and I went to school on Monday, and I taught 22 third graders how to write a paragraph, and I acted like my life was exactly what it appeared to be. It happened again 6 weeks later, and again 2 months after that. Each time there was a reason. Each time there was an apology. Each time I made myself believe it was the last time. The cycle was so well established by the time I recognized it that I was already deep inside it, already rearranging myself around his moods, already tracking the temperature of the house the moment I heard his car in the driveway. He never hit me where it would be easy to see. He was a careful man. He hit me on the back, on my upper arms, across the back of my head. He would grab my wrists and squeeze until I gasped. Once he pushed me into the door frame of our bathroom, and I had a bruise along my shoulder for 3 weeks that I told my doctor came from carrying heavy boxes when I cleaned out a closet at school. My doctor. My trusted doctor of 15 years. I sat across from her in that examination room and lied to her face. I didn't tell my daughter. I couldn't bear to. She had struggled when I divorced her father years ago, and I had watched her work so hard to build a relationship with my husband. She called him once a week. She included him in birthday plans and holiday dinners. If I told her the truth, I knew it would devastate her in ways that had nothing to do with me, and I told myself I was protecting her. Really, I think I was protecting myself from having to say it out loud. I didn't tell my sister. She lived in Arizona, and we talked every Sunday, and every Sunday I gave her an edited version of my life that left out the most important parts. I became very good at editing. By the 3rd year of his abuse, I had stopped going to church because he came with me, and I couldn't sit next to him in a pew and sing hymns about grace without feeling like a fraud. I had reduced contact with my daughter to phone calls because visits required too much management, too much hiding of whatever was visible. I had retired from teaching, which I told everyone was planned, but was actually because he had decided my evenings in summer should be spent at home, and fighting about it cost more than it was worth. I was 62 years old, and I had made myself very small. The worst period was the last 18 months. He had retired too, which meant we were together constantly. There was nowhere in my own house that felt safe. I learned to read the morning, learned to identify within the first 10 minutes of waking whether it was going to be a bearable day or not. I walked carefully. I spoke carefully. I became a woman I would not have recognized 10 years earlier, someone who apologized for everything and said what she was supposed to say and kept her thoughts very quietly behind her teeth. He started telling me things, small things at first, and then larger ones, that I had let myself go, that I embarrassed him in social situations, that my daughter only called out of obligation, that my friends from my old life had moved on because I was, and here he used a specific word that I won't repeat, uninteresting. He said these things in a conversational tone, the way you might comment on the weather, and over time they settled into me and became things I believed. I want you to understand that by this point, I was not the woman who had walked down that church aisle 9 years earlier. That woman had opinions and a laugh that filled rooms and a classroom full of children who brought her drawings on the last day of school every year. The woman I had become would not have recognized her. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Wednesday in November. I remember because my daughter had called that afternoon and I hadn't answered. He was home, and it was easier not to answer than to have a conversation he could overhear and later interrogate me about. She left a voicemail that I listened to in the bathroom with the door locked, her voice warm and ordinary, asking if I wanted to come for Thanksgiving this year, that she and her husband would love to have me. I was sitting on the edge of the bathtub, crying quietly, when he knocked on the door and asked what I was doing in there so long. That evening he found something to be angry about. The details no longer matter to me. It could have been anything. It always could have been anything. He backed me against the wall in the hallway outside our bedroom, and when I tried to move past him, he grabbed me by the shoulders and threw me. I don't know exactly how to describe what happened next, except that I was standing and then I wasn't. My head hit the corner of the narrow hallway table on my way down. I remember the sound of it. Then I remember the carpet against my cheek. Then I remember nothing. When I came back to awareness, I was in the passenger seat of our car, and he was driving fast and talking to himself in a low, urgent voice. My head felt wrong, heavy and distant at the same time. I tried to lift it and couldn't. She slipped, he was saying. Coming down the stairs in the dark, she slipped and fell. I heard her fall and came to help her. She must have hit her head on the banister coming down. He said it several times. He adjusted words. Changed banister to railing, added that I had mentioned earlier that I wasn't feeling well. He was composing a story in the front seat of our car while I lay semi-conscious beside him, and even through the fog, I understood what was happening. He was frightened. Not for me, for himself. I'll be honest with you. My first thought when I understood we were going to the hospital was not relief. It was terror, because I knew he would be there. He would stand next to me in that emergency room, and his hand would be on my arm, and everything I said would be monitored. He had told me more than once that if I ever spoke to anyone about what happened at home, he would make sure no one believed me. He was on the church board. He knew the county sheriff personally. He was a quiet, well-dressed, well-regarded man of 67, and I was a retired schoolteacher who had become, according to him, increasingly unstable. I had no proof. I had nothing. I had years of silence that worked against me as surely as it had worked against me staying. I don't remember arriving at the hospital. I remember bright lights and a face close to mine asking me my name and whether I knew what day it was. I gave them my name. I didn't know the day. I could hear him somewhere nearby, speaking in his concerned voice, the one that sounded so much like a man who loved his wife that I once found it comforting. She slipped on the stairs. He was telling someone. I found her at the bottom. She's been having some balance issues lately. I've been after her to see her doctor about it. They moved me to a bay in the emergency room. A young nurse, maybe in her early 30s, with her hair pulled back and a no-nonsense efficiency about her, began taking my blood pressure and asking me questions. He stood at the foot of the bed. I could see him without looking directly at him, which was a skill I had developed over 8 years. The doctor came quickly. He was a large, unhurried man with gray at his temples and reading glasses pushed up on his head. He asked me what happened, and before I could form an answer, my husband stepped forward with the story about the stairs, the balance issues, the darkness, the banister. The doctor listened. Then he said to me, very gently, "Can you tell me in your own words?" I looked at my husband. His expression was calm and careful, and his eyes said everything they needed to say. "I fell on the stairs," I said. "I don't remember exactly what happened." The doctor nodded. They needed to do a CT scan and check for a concussion. The nurse was taking my blood pressure when she pushed up my sleeve and paused for just a moment. I saw her eyes go to my arm. Then she continued what she was doing and didn't say anything. But she had seen it. I knew she had seen it. There were bruises on my upper arm from 3 days before, yellow and fading, and fresh ones from tonight layered over them. They took me for the scan. My husband was told to wait in the family room. I heard him protest and heard the nurse explain hospital policy in a tone that did not invite negotiation. The last thing I saw before they wheeled me out was his face, composed and pleasant on the surface, with that particular flatness behind his eyes that I had learned to dread. In the hallway away from him, the nurse leaned down toward me. She didn't introduce herself first. She just said quietly and directly, "Those bruises on your arm are not from tonight." I didn't say anything. "I've been an ER nurse for 9 years," she said. "Talk to me when you're ready." "You're safe right now." I started crying. Not the quiet, careful crying I had taught myself over 8 years, the kind that didn't make a sound and left minimal evidence. I mean the real kind, the kind that comes from somewhere below your ribs, the kind that sounds like grief because it is grief. She held my hand until I could breathe again, and she didn't say anything, and that silence was one of the kindest things anyone had done for me in years. I couldn't tell her everything right then. He was still in the building. He was still my husband. He was still the man who had told me, in a calm and pleasant voice over a Sunday breakfast 6 months ago, that if I ever tried to leave or talk to anyone, he had letters prepared and people who would confirm that I had become confused and accusatory in my old age, that I had a history of emotional instability. I didn't know if any of that was true or possible, but I had believed him because I had been believing him for 8 years, and I didn't know how to stop. The scan took 20 minutes. When they brought me back, I was in a different room. He was not there yet. The nurse was there. She was standing near the window, and when she saw my face, she came and stood close to me. "You don't have to say anything specific," she said. "I just need you to nod if the injuries on your arm didn't come from a fall." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I nodded. She nodded back, slowly, like this was confirmation of something she already knew. "Okay," she said, "the doctor is going to want to talk with you. I'm going to be here." My husband was brought back to the room shortly after. He sat beside me and held my hand and performed his concern with the particular fluency of someone who had practiced it. He asked the nurse about my test results in a warm, worried voice. He patted my hand. He called me sweetheart, which he almost never did at home. The doctor came in and closed the door behind him. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at me and then at my husband, and then at me again. He had a tablet with my test results and he held it without looking at it. He said, "The scan shows a moderate concussion and soft tissue swelling consistent with impact against a hard surface." He said, "We also documented contusions on your upper arm in multiple stages of healing." He paused. Then he said, "The injury pattern I'm seeing is not consistent with a single fall. The bruising on your arm indicates repeated trauma over a period of weeks." I watched my husband's face. He froze. That is the only word for it. He was mid-expression, somewhere between concern and helpfulness, and he simply stopped. His mouth stayed slightly open. The hand holding mine went still. For the first time in 9 years, I saw him without a ready answer, without a next move, without the smooth machinery of his composure engaged and running. He just sat there with the story crumbling behind his eyes. "Sir," the doctor said, "I'm going to need to ask you to step outside." My husband recovered himself quickly. He was still my husband. He said, "I think there's been some misunderstanding." He said, "I'm not leaving my wife." He said it with tremendous reasonableness, like a man who simply wanted to be supportive. The doctor said, "This is not a discussion. There are 2 security officers outside this door. You can walk out on your own, or they can assist you. Your choice." He looked at me. I made myself look back at him. I didn't look away. He was calculating something. I could see it, running through options. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and in a voice that was perfectly pleasant, perfectly level, said to me, "I'll be right outside." It was a threat dressed as a reassurance. I had heard that voice for 9 years. I knew exactly what it was. The door closed behind him, and I could breathe. The doctor pulled a chair close to my bed and sat down. The nurse stood on the other side. And the doctor looked at me and said, "I need you to tell me the truth. Your husband did this to you." I had spent 8 years not saying it. 8 years of editing and managing and choosing silence because silence felt safer than the alternative. I had told the lie so many times to so many people that part of me had started to believe I was protecting something by keeping it. But sitting in that room with a doctor who already knew the answer to his question and a nurse who was still holding the edge of my blanket like a person ready to catch something, I was very tired. "Yes," I said, "my husband did this to me. He's been doing it for years." Once I started, I couldn't find the place to stop. I told them about the first time. I told them about the pattern, about the careful placement of injuries, about the financial control, about how he had systematically narrowed my life until I had almost no one left. I told them about my daughter, whose voicemail I hadn't answered that afternoon, whose voice on the phone I had been aching to hear properly for months. The doctor and the nurse listened to all of it without interrupting and without the particular expression I had feared, the one that says, "This is difficult to believe." They believed me. Without question, without hesitation, they believed me. A social worker came. Her name was Patricia. She was about my age, practical and warm, and she told me she had been doing this work for 22 years. She sat with me while the doctor called security and while a police officer was requested. "He's still in the building," I said. He told me if I ever talked to anyone, he had people who would say I was unstable, that I have a history. "I'm afraid he'll say I invented all of this." "Your medical record doesn't lie," Patricia said. "The bruise pattern doesn't lie." Patricia said, "The bruise pattern doesn't lie. The doctor has already documented everything." His word against yours stopped being the situation the moment that doctor walked into this room. The police officer who came was a woman, Officer Tran. She was younger than I expected, and she had a careful, unhurried way of asking questions that reminded me of the way I used to manage a difficult parent-teacher conference. She took my statement, she photographed my arm, she told me about the process for an emergency protective order. While she was still in the room, another officer went to speak to my husband in the family waiting area. I learned later that when they approached him, he initially maintained the story about the stairs. He maintained it right up until the point where they mentioned the medical documentation. Then he changed his account. Then he said I had a history of falling. Then he said we had been having marital difficulties and I was perhaps seeking attention. He went through 3 different versions in the space of 20 minutes, and each version contradicted the one before it. They arrested him in the hospital parking lot. Officer Tran came back to tell me. She stood in the doorway of my room and said, "He's in custody. I want you to know that. He is not in the building anymore." I didn't cry. I think I had run out of tears for that particular night. I just nodded and said thank you in a voice that didn't sound like mine yet. Patricia sat with me while we called my daughter. I hadn't spoken to her properly in months. I had been so careful, so managed, so edited every time she called that I think she had started to believe I had grown distant from her. I let Patricia explain the situation first. I could hear my daughter's breathing change on the phone. Then she said, "Mom, just Mom." And then she was crying, and so was I, and neither of us said anything useful for a long time. She drove the 40 minutes to the hospital and arrived before midnight. When she walked into my room and saw me in that bed, she made a sound I hope never to hear from her again. She held my hands very gently, like I was something that might come apart. She didn't ask why I hadn't told her. She didn't ask why I had stayed. She just sat on the edge of my bed and held my hands and said, "You're safe now. You're safe." I stayed in the hospital overnight. I was admitted for observation because of the concussion. My daughter stayed with me. She slept in the chair beside my bed, and in the morning her neck was stiff and she was still there. In the weeks that followed, everything moved both faster and slower than I expected. faster because the legal machinery, once engaged, has its own momentum. My husband was charged with domestic battery and false imprisonment. The evidence was substantial. My medical records, the photographs of my injuries, the documentation of bruising in multiple stages of healing. Officer Tran's report. The contradictions in his statements at the hospital. Slower because healing has no momentum at all. It moves at its own pace and it cannot be hurried. He hired a very good lawyer. I expected that. At the preliminary hearing, his lawyer argued that I had a history of health problems that could explain the bruising, that my account was colored by the mental and emotional difficulties of an older woman going through a difficult life transition. The judge looked at the medical documentation and denied the motion. He was offered a plea agreement. He took it because the alternative was a trial with evidence he could not explain away. He pled guilty to domestic battery and received a sentence of 5 years with 2 suspended, meaning 3 years to be served. Additionally, a permanent no-contact order was issued, which means he cannot approach me, contact me, or communicate with me in any way for the rest of our lives. I was not in the room when he pled. I want to be honest about that. I chose not to be. I had already said everything I needed to say to the people who needed to hear it, and I did not need to sit in a room and watch his lawyer negotiate a convenient outcome. What I chose to do instead was sit in my daughter's kitchen and drink coffee and watch her youngest, my 6-year-old granddaughter, arrange small plastic animals in a row along the windowsill in a logic known only to herself. That was a better use of my morning. I did give a victim impact statement at sentencing. I had written it over several weeks, late at night, at a desk in the small apartment I had moved into after leaving the house. An apartment that was entirely mine in a way nothing had been entirely mine for almost a decade. I chose the furniture. I chose the colors on the walls, a particular shade of soft yellow in the kitchen that I had always loved and never been allowed. I hung photographs of my daughter and my granddaughter and my sister. I hung a drawing one of my students had given me the last day I taught, a child's rendering of a classroom with the figure at the front labeled MRS Dorothy in large, uneven letters. At the sentencing, I stood in front of the judge and I read what I had written. I won't give you all of it, but I want to give you part of it because it took me a long time to be able to write it and I think it matters. I said, I am 64 years old and I spent 8 years being afraid in my own home. I am a retired school teacher and a mother and a grandmother and a woman of faith, and I spent 8 years believing I deserved what was happening to me. I do not say that to invite sympathy. I say it because I need you to understand who this man chose as his victim. He chose me. He chose someone with a full life and a career and a daughter and a community. He chose someone who had every reason to speak up and systematically removed every reason until speaking up felt impossible. That is not passion or temper or marital discord. That is calculation. It is the kind of harm that leaves its deepest scars where no one can see them. When I was finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. The judge thanked me and then sentenced my husband to the terms already agreed upon. As the bailiff moved to escort him out, he turned and looked at me once. I looked back at him. I did not look away. I watched his face until he was gone from the room, and in that moment I remembered who I was before I met him, the woman who stood in front of a classroom for 31 years and held her ground, and I understood that she had been there the whole time. Even in the worst years, even when she was most afraid, she had never actually left. I want to talk to you now, directly, if that's all right. Not about my story anymore, but about you. If you're watching this and you recognize pieces of what I've described, I need you to hear something from a woman who is 64 years old and has learned this the long, painful way. You do not have to be young to leave. You do not have to have an escape plan fully formed before you make the first move. You do not have to have proof before you speak. You do not have to be believed by everyone. You only need one person in the right position to see the truth. One doctor, one nurse, one officer, one advocate, one friend who refuses to stop asking questions. They exist. I promise you they exist. And if you're staying because you are ashamed, because you believe what he has told you about yourself, because you think that at your age the options have narrowed to something unworkable, I need you to hear me say that none of that is true. The shame belongs to him. The lies he told you about who you are belong to him. He worked very hard to make you believe them because your belief was the only thing keeping you in place. You are not what he told you. You are what you were before he got a hold of you. And that person is still there. I know because I spent 8 years thinking she was gone, and the moment I walked out of that hospital with my daughter beside me, there she was. To anyone who has a mother or an aunt or an older friend, and something doesn't sit right when you see her, when she seems quieter than she used to be, when her husband always seems to be nearby, when she makes excuses and cancels plans and flinches in ways she didn't used to flinch. Please ask her. Ask her directly. Ask her when he's not in the room. Let her know that whatever the answer is, you will believe her. You will not judge her. You will not ask her why she didn't leave sooner. You will not ask her why she didn't leave sooner. You will just be there. That is enough. That is everything. If you are in danger right now, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START to 88788. Both are free and confidential, available every hour of every day. There are people on the other end of those numbers who understand what you are living through and who will help you find a way out. Please use them. I live in a different city now. I have a small apartment with yellow walls and photographs of everyone I love and a desk where I write things like this. My daughter calls me every few days. My granddaughter draws pictures for me, and my daughter photographs them and sends them. My sister came and stayed with me for 3 weeks when I first moved, and we sat up late talking in a way we hadn't in years, filling in the gaps I had left in all those Sunday phone calls for so long. I am in therapy. I will probably be in therapy for some time, and I am at peace with that. What was done to me over 8 years does not unwind in a season. I have panic in crowded parking garages. I have mornings where the grief of wasted years is so present and so heavy, I cannot get up quickly. I have days where I still hear his voice telling me that I am uninteresting, that no one is coming, that at my age there is nothing left. On those days, I go to my kitchen window and I look at the street below and I think about a 6-year-old girl arranging plastic animals on a windowsill, and I think about a classroom drawing that says MRS Dorothy in big uneven letters. And I think about my daughter driving 40 minutes in the dark to sit beside my hospital bed and hold my hands very gently, and I remind myself what is actually true. My husband is in prison. I am not afraid anymore. And I am, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where I am supposed to be. If this story reached you today, if something in it was familiar, please share it. Someone in your life may need to hear it. Please like the video and subscribe to Twisted ZYN Stories for more stories like this one. And please leave a word of encouragement in the comments for anyone who may be reading them and looking for a reason to take the first step. You never know who is watching. You never know what one comment might mean to someone sitting alone and afraid, trying to decide whether speaking up is worth it. It is worth it. I promise you, it is worth every terrifying second. Thank you for listening. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see when I was living inside it. Every choice my husband made, the isolation, the control, the careful placement of harm where no one could see it. Those choices built a wall around him just as surely as they built a cage around me. He believed he was protected by my silence. He believed that my shame was his insurance, and for 8 years he was right. But here's what he never accounted for. Silence has a breaking point. And mine broke on a gurney in an emergency room in November, under fluorescent lights, with a nurse who had been doing her job for 9 years and knew exactly what she was looking at. That is the thing about actions taken in the dark. They do not stay there forever. The bruises my husband left on my arms told the truth even when my voice couldn't. The medical record told the truth. The contradictions in his own account told the truth. He had spent years convincing me that no one would believe me, that his word would always outweigh mine. What he didn't understand was that the evidence he left on my body was its own testimony, patient and permanent and entirely beyond his control. I think about Dorothy, the woman I was before I walked into that marriage, the one who stood in front of a classroom for 31 years and held her ground on hard days and found something to laugh about on harder ones. He worked very deliberately to make me forget she existed, and I almost did. That is the part that stays with me most. Not the physical harm, but how close I came to losing myself entirely, to accepting the diminished version of my life as the only version available. What brought me back was not a single moment of courage. I want to be honest about that because I think we do survivors a disservice when we talk about leaving as if it requires one great act of bravery. It required a nurse who asked a quiet question in a hallway. It required a doctor who looked at evidence and refused to look away. It required my daughter's voice on a voicemail I almost didn't listen to. Strength, I have learned, is not always something you find inside yourself alone. Sometimes it is handed to you by someone else at exactly the moment you have run out of your own. What I carry forward from everything I lived through is a belief in the quiet power of staying true to who you actually are, even when someone is working very hard to convince you otherwise. My husband's cruelty was a reflection of his own fractures, not a measure of my worth. The moment I understood that, something shifted that has not shifted back. If you are carrying something heavy right now, something you have not told anyone, I hope this story reminds you that the truth has a way of finding the light eventually. Not because of fate or fortune, but because human beings, when they are paying attention, can recognize what is real. Be around people who are paying attention. Tell the truth when you find the moment to tell it. And remember that the version of yourself that existed before the harm found you is not gone. She is just waiting for the conditions to come back.